Event-driven architecture uses events to communicate and trigger actions across services. A popular battle-tested tool for producing and consuming events is Kafka. In this video, we're going to learn how to connect a Kafka consumer and producer to our Node.js applications, as well as the tooling required for local development all the way into production. Working with Kafka can be like working with a black box. Without the right tooling, it can be really difficult to see what's going on inside. The tool that I personally use to peer inside my Kafka clusters is Conduktor. I reached out to the Conduktor team to sponsor a video, and when they agreed, I was thrilled to produce this video. Conduktor will be with you all the way from local development into production with their suite of modern Kafka tooling. Conduktor has a generous free-for-life offering that we're going to take advantage of in this video. So what is it that we're going to be building? We're going to start off with a small microservice architecture. This architecture just includes two services, a message service and a notification service. The message service has its own database, so each service inside of a microservice architecture needs to have its own database. The messages service is going to produce messages, and then the notification service is going to consume these messages. So what's happening here is in a real-world application, you would have a message service that's used to create messages, and it would produce an event that says a message has been created. That message would be consumed by a notification service, which would be responsible for filtering these messages and then sending out, say, push notifications or even emails or text messages based on the filters and what the message is. So what are you going to need to follow along? Well, you're going to need Docker. We're going to rely on Docker pretty heavily in this video, and you're also going to need Node.js. We're going to use the Kafka.js dependency. There's a few different dependencies that you could use for Kafka in your Node.js applications. The one that we're going to use is Kafka.js. The reason for that is because it's the most popular and it has a really good API. There's a ton of different things to learn in this video. You're going to learn how to set up a Kafka cluster for local development with Docker, and I'm going to provide you with a Docker Compose file to do that. That's going to be really simple. We're going to learn how to connect a producer. We're going to learn how to connect a consumer. So the producer is going to be our messages service, and then the consumer is going to be our notification service. We're going to learn about graceful shutdowns, and this is going to disconnect our producer and consumer from the cluster. This is a really important part of working with Kafka inside of your applications, whether you're using Node.js or not. And we're going to learn about using Conduktor to view and manage our clusters. So why use Kafka? Kafka is a distributed streaming platform. It's going to scale horizontally. It's extremely fault tolerant, it is very fast, and it's used by a lot of companies, including Uber, Netflix, and LinkedIn. I'm going to show you a demonstration of just how fault tolerant Kafka is in this video. You're going to see that even when our application isn't running, we're not going to have any messages lost. So here are some terms and definitions that you're going to need to know when working with Kafka. I'm not going to bore you by going through these terms right now, but we are going to be using these throughout the video, so we might come back and see the definition for these terms as we go along. If you have a look in the description below, you'll see a link to a GitHub repository. If you have a look in the description below, you'll see a link to a GitHub repository. Inside of that GitHub repository, you're going to see three folders. The first one is Conduktor, and this is going to include our Docker Compose file. There's also a README in here that's going to show you how to work with this Docker Compose file, but we're going to go through that in this video. The next folder is our end, and this is going to consume all of our finished code. And in this video, this is the folder that I'm going to be working from. The next folder is our start folder. So if you would like to follow along, then you can follow along inside of this start folder, and you're going to be starting where I'm starting. So the first thing that I want to do is get a running instance of Kafka and Conduktor. So let's go have a look in this Docker Compose file here. You can see here that we're starting the Conduktor platform. And we're going to give this some platform configuration here. You can see this config here, but you don't need to know too much about this. The next service we're going to start is Zookeeper, and nobody actually knows what this does. You just need it to run Kafka. The next service that we're going to run is Kafka, and this is going to use the Conduktor Kafka image. And then we're going to pass in some environment variables here. Kafka, of course, depends on Zookeeper. We're going to have a schema registry. We're not actually going to use the schema registry, but it's here just in case you would like to use it. So if I open up this README file here, you can see here that we need to make sure we can execute our launch and our utils local scripts here. So we can use this chmod, and I can cd into Conduktor, and then I can chmod launch and utils local. So now I can execute these two files. The next thing I need to do is just execute launch. So I need to put in my organization here. So I'm just going to put in Tom does tech. I need to put in an admin email, and this is the admin email that you're going to use to log into the Conductor platform. So I'm going to put tom@tomdoestech.com. Next, we need to supply a password. And again, this is going to be the password that you use to log into the Conductor platform. So password. So I already have all of these images downloaded. So you can see that mine started very fast, but yours may take a little longer as it downloads all of the images. So if I come over to Docker Hub, you can see that I have the Conductor platform running here. So if I come over to a browser, you can see that I have the Conductor platform starting up. And this is going to take just a moment, and then you'll be able to log into Conductor. If you do come across any issues starting the containers from the launch script, make sure you have enough resources allocated to Docker. So out of the box, Docker only has a certain number of CPU and RAM allocated to it. So you can click on the little settings at the top here, and then you can click on resources. I think 2 CPUs is enough. I have 10 gigabytes of memory allocated. If you have any other issues, you can also stop all of your containers. Once they've all exited, you can delete this container here. You can come back up into your settings. You can allocate some more resources here. Restart Docker. And then you can come back and you can try run the launch script again. So I'm going to create my containers again. So Tom does tech, tom@tomdoestech.com, and then password is just going to be my password. And you can see here that the Conductor platform has started up perfectly fine. So I'm going to log in with tom@tomdoestech.com and then password. So the URL that I've come over to is localhost port 8080. And then once you log in, the first items you're going to see is some navigation around the portal. What we're going to be using is the console, but testing is also really cool. We can go in and we can have a look at this really quickly. So you can see here that we can connect to our Kafka cluster, and then you can create a test suite, create a test scenario, and then you can execute your scenarios. So this is going to make sure that your Kafka clusters are working as you expect them to work. So let's come over to console here. You can see in the top right-hand corner here, I have my local Kafka cluster, and it says connected. This is really important. It must say connected here. If it doesn't, then you're going to have to troubleshoot your connection to your Kafka cluster. But if you use the launch script provided, this should all work out of the box. So here we have our topics, and you can see that we have these 2 topics here, local permissions defined and local producer heartbeat. So the first screen is going to be our topics, and you can see that I have 2 topics here, and I have 53 partitions in my Kafka cluster. When we create new topics, they're going to appear here. If the topics don't appear here, you can actually create them inside of the Conductor platform, and this is just one little feature that I find extremely handy. So you can create the topic, you can define the partitions and the replication factor. Before we go any further, let's just go back to our definitions to see what a topic is. So you can see here, a topic is a category or feed name to which records are published. Topics in Kafka are always multi-subscriber. So we're going to publish a message under a specific topic. The topic we're going to use is message created, and then we're going to subscribe to that topic in another service. So the first thing that we want to do is to produce a topic. So let's go into end here, and I'm going to open up messages. This is just a simple Fastify application here. You can see in my routes, I just have one route, and this is going to be a post request, and it's just going to create a message, and then we're going to respond with a 201 message created. If we come over to our app.ts, you can see that we just have a main. Our main gets executed at the bottom of the file, and we're just going to listen on port 3000. We're also going to connect to our database inside of this file. So inside my utils, I'm going to create a new file in here, and I'm going to call this kafka.ts. I'm going to open up a new terminal, and I'm just going to cd into end, and I'm going to say yarn add kafka.js. Then I'm going to import from Kafka Node.js, and I'm going to import Kafka. So Kafka is a constructor, and then we can use this to create a new instance of Kafka. So I'm going to say const Kafka with a lowercase k equals new Kafka. And then we can provide an object of arguments here. So I'm going to have my client ID, and I'm just going to set my client here to messages app. Next, I need to define my brokers. So at the top here, so I'm going to say const brokers is equal to an array. So we can have multiple brokers here. We're just going to have one. If we go back to our definitions file, you can see here a broker is a server that hosts a topic. Each broker is identified by a unique ID. So to find the broker's address, we can go back over to Docker, and then we can click on our Kafka container here. Then we can click inspect, and you can see we have some ports here. So we have this one here, 0.0.0, and it's running on port 9092. So that is going to be our broker. So we can pass our brokers into our new instance of Kafka. The next thing we need to do is to create a producer. So I'm going to say const producer is equal to Kafka.producer, and then we just need to execute that function. The next thing we need to do is we need to export two functions, one to connect to Kafka, and then another function to disconnect from Kafka when our application gets a kill signal. So I'm going to export an async function, connect to Kafka. And this is going to call a promise called producer.connect. So we know this is a promise here from the type definitions, and it just returns void. So we don't need to return anything from this function. Then we can export an async function, disconnect from Kafka. And this is just going to return producer.disconnect. So the next thing we need is a function to produce a message. So I'm going to export an async function called sendMessage. SendMessage is going to take a topic, which is going to be a string, and then a message, and we're just going to type message as any. In fact, we can do a better job of typing our topic here. Usually when you're working with Kafka, you need something to register all of your different topics and share them around your services. I do recommend creating a package that you can install in all of your services that keeps a list of all the topics and then a schema for all of those topics. And this is going to make sure that when you're consuming a message, it is the message that you expect to consume. So I'm just going to say const topics is equal to an array, and then we're just going to have an array of strings. So this is going to be message created. You can of course call this topic whatever you like. And then I'm just going to say as const. So you can see what as const does. It defines this as a read-only array of these string literals. If I remove a const, you can see that it's just an array of strings. Now we can define our topic as type of topics. And it's just going to be one of those topics. So we need to get it by an index here, and we can do that with number. Okay, so I told you that Kafka.js was really simple, and I didn't lie, and you're going to see this right here. So this is going to return producer.send. The first thing we need to put in is going to be our topic. The next thing is going to be our messages. So we can send out multiple messages, and here we're just going to provide an array with one message. If you're going to batch up sending out these messages, then you'll want to pass in an array of messages here. This is going to be an object. We're going to have a value, and then our value is just going to be message. So let's go back to our routes. And when we create a message object here, we also want to produce a Kafka message so we can consume that later on. So I want to call await produce. What do we call this? We call this send message. Await send message. We want to provide a topic of message created. And then our message is going to be a JSON stringified version of our message object here. So TypeScript is complaining because send message doesn't take an object. It just takes two properties. So let's fix that up. So now that we have our producer, the next thing to do is to connect to our producer. So I'm going to come over to our app, and just under where we connect to our database, I'm going to say await connect to Kafka. And this should actually be connect producer, because in some applications, you're going to want to have a producer and a consumer, and you want to be able to connect to them separately. So you could just say connect to Kafka, and then you could put your consumer connection in here as well. But I like to keep them separate. So I'm going to rename mine to connect producer. And then I'm going to rename this as well, connect producer. And let's just add a console.log producer connected. And let's type yarn dev to start up our server. So we have our application up and running, and you can see here that we've connected to MongoDB and we've connected our producer. So the next thing we need to do is make sure we disconnect our producer when we shut down our application. So I'm going to come back into app, and I'm going to create a function here. So this is going to be an async function, graceful shutdown. And inside of this function, I'm going to call await disconnect from Kafka. Then I'm going to exit with a status code of 1. I could also disconnect from my database in this function. I could also close down my application. So let's also do that. So I'm going to say we're going to get an app, and this is going to be a return type of create server. And then app is going to be a promise. So we need to say it's an awaited version. So then we can call await app.close. Now to use this, we need some kill signals to listen to. So I'm going to say const signals is going to be equal to sigint, sigterm, and sigquit. Now we need to loop through these signals. So I'm going to say for let I equals 0. You obviously don't have to use a for loop. You can use whatever loop you like. Then we're going to get the signal in this iteration of the loop. Then we're going to say process.on. So when we get one of these signals here, we're going to call our graceful shutdown function, and we're going to execute that with our app that we defined up above here. So let's start up our application, and then we can press Control-C, and you can see that we execute our graceful shutdown function, and then we're going to exit our application. So let's also log in here. I'm going to say await, and then console.log producer disconnected. Start up again. Press Control-C, and we get our producer disconnecting before our application exits. So let's start up our application here, and I'm going to come over to Postman, and I'm going to send in this post request here to /API/v1/messages, and this is the route that our application is listening on. We just have a body here of text. You can see that we get our message back here. So let's go over to the Conductor platform, and we can start listening to these messages. So you can see here in my topics now, I have message created. So I can click on this, and we have 2 messages in here. This is our message with hello, and we have 2 of these because I sent it in twice. Let's send it in again with a different message. So this is going to be hello again. Send this. And we can refresh here, and you can see that we now have our next message here. So our producer is working correctly. Let's go over and create a consumer to consume this message. So I'm going to collapse our messages folder here, and I'm going to come into notifications. Inside of notifications, we're going to do the same sort of setup. So inside of utils, I'm going to create a new file here. I'm going to call this kafka.ts. I'm going to import from Kafka.js, and I'm going to import Kafka, the constructor with a capital K, const Kafka equals new Kafka. Then we need to pass in our brokers again. So I'm going to come over to our messages Kafka instance, and I'm just going to copy this brokers array here. And I'll say brokers. Now we need to provide a client ID. So I'm going to say client ID, and then this is just going to be notifications service. So there's lots of different ways that you can set up your consumer because you're going to want to execute a function that does some business logic. But I'm just going to show you a very simple way, and then you can expand on that where you need. I'm going to come over and I'm going to copy my topics array here again because we want that too. I'm going to paste that in. Next, I'm going to say const consumer is going to be equal to Kafka.consumer. And then we need to pass in an object. We need to pass in a group ID, and this is going to be our notification service. So the next thing I want to do is to create a map of topics that I want to subscribe to, because not every application is going to subscribe to every topic, and we need to tell it what function to execute when we get a message for a given topic. So I'm going to say const topics to subscribe is equal to an object. And the first property in that object is going to be our key. So this is going to be of type message created, but let's make sure that we get this right. So I'm going to type this as a record, and then the key is going to be type of topics. And then the object property is just going to be a function. So we're going to get message created. And then we need to execute a function. So I'm going to define async function message created handler. And then we're going to get the data or the body of the message. This doesn't actually need to be an async function. Then we can pass that in as the property for message created. And type of topics needs to have number as well. So you can see here, if I name this anything else, then TypeScript is going to complain at me. So this needs to be message created. If we had other topics here as well that we wanted to listen to, then we would need to have a property inside of this object here. The next thing I want to do is to export a function to connect to consumer. So I'm going to say export function connect consumer. And this is need to be an async function. I'm going to say await consumer.connect. I'm going to do console.log connected to consumer. So connecting to a consumer isn't enough. We also need to subscribe to the topics. So I'm going to loop over all of my topics and then subscribe to each one. So I'm going to say for let I equals 0, I is less than topics dot length. Next, I'm going to call await consumer dot subscribe. I'm going to get my topic that I'm going to subscribe to. So this is going to be topics and then the ith value. And then we want to subscribe from the beginning. Okay, so now we need to tell the consumer what to do once we get a message on that topic. So I'm going to say await consumer.run. And then we need to give this an object of configuration. So the first object is going to be each message. So this is going to loop through each message that we get. So by default, Kafka.js is going to consume in a batch. And this is a really good thing. It means that you can consume a bunch of messages all at once, and then you can handle them all together inside of your application asynchronously. So I'm going to say if not message or not message.value, then we just want to return out of this function. And this is to keep TypeScript happy more than anything else. Next, we need to get the data. So to get the data, I'm going to call json.pass on our message value, and then I'm going to pass our message value to a string. So this is going to be a stringified object, and then we're going to call json.pass on it to turn it into workable JSON. Next, we want to get the handler, and we can use our object up here for topics to subscribe to get the handler given the topic that we got a message for. So I'm going to say const handler is equal to topics to subscribe, and then we're going to get it by the topic here. So this topic is always, in our case, going to equal message created. Next, we can say if handler, and again, this is to keep TypeScript happy more than anything. We can execute our handler with the data here. So we only have one handler, and this is going to be our data. So I'm going to say console.log got a new message, and then we can just pass in our data here. Actually, let's say json.stringify, and we're going to stringify this with null2. So before we can use our consumer, we need to connect to our consumer. So we're going to come over to app.ts, and instead of our main function, I'm going to call await connect to consumer, and I'm going to execute that. Then we need to make sure that we do our graceful shutdowns as well. So I'm going to say async function graceful shutdown. Again, we're going to get an instance of our app, which is going to be an awaited version of return type of create server. Then we're console.log shutting down. We're going to say await app.close, and then we're going to disconnect. We haven't actually created a disconnect function, so let's make sure we do that. Export async function disconnect consumer. Then we're going to say await consumer disconnect, and then we're going to console log disconnected from consumer. Inside of our graceful shutdown, I'm going to call process.exit, and I also want to call await disconnect from consumer. Okay, so let's start this up. So I'm inside of my notifications application. I'm going to type yarn dev. And you can see here that it's already started consuming these messages. The reason that it's already started consuming these messages is because if we go back into the consumer, you can see here we've told it to consume from the beginning. So it's going to go back and consume all the messages that it missed. Let's shut it down again, and we can produce a few more messages. So let's come back into Conductor, and you can see here that we can produce a message. I'm just going to copy a payload from one of my other messages. And then I'm going to set the value to this, and this is going to say hello from Conductor. And then I can click produce. You can see that our message was produced. We can come back to our application and type yarn dev again. And you can see that we got our message, hello from Conductor. And this is what I mean when I say Conductor is extremely fault tolerant. Even if your application is down when you get a message, Kafka is still going to get the message to your application. Okay, so let's give this an end-to-end test. So I'm going to go back into Postman. I'm going to make the text end-to-end test. Click send. And we should see the message come into our notification service where we have our consumer. So that is how to connect a Kafka consumer and producer to your Node.js applications. If you enjoyed this video, please make sure you leave a thumbs up. And thank you again to Conductor for sponsoring this video. Let me know in the comment section below what you're using Kafka for. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.